Good morning. May I invite you to take seats, and the most comfortable ones, and I see that the front rows are still somewhat empty, so don't be shy. Please come closer. You might get better access to speakers and presentations. And I do hope that some more people will come, because it seems that not everyone is here. Probably some people still queuing, but I would suggest us to start, as we have a really packed agenda with, well, we do expect quite also, well, of course, interesting presentations from those who will give presentations, but also we do want to leave some time for discussion. So to kick off this nature conference today, with pleasure, I would like to invite Mr. Kaspars Gerhards, Minister for Environmental Protection and Regional Development, to give the introductory opening remarks. Please.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Riga and welcome to conference on the EU Biodiversity Strategy implementation. The theme of biodiversity has a prominent role in the Presidency's agenda. This has several reasons. First of all, this is a significant year for the biodiversity in Europe, a year when the midterm review of the EU Biodiversity Strategy will be prepared. We have to assess whether we are progressing towards the goal of halting the loss of biodiversity. That is also why we decided to focus our informal Environmental Council on biodiversity issues. It took place in the middle of April in Riga. There we heard strong commitments by ministers towards protection of biodiversity. Secondly, there are strong emotional reasons for Latvians and connection with nature. For centuries, Latvians have lived in harmony with nature, cherishing the value of nature. This has been a strong guiding principle in most economic activities. In Europe, recently two important reports have been published. Both of them, the State of Environment report and the State of Nature report, cause serious concerns. They bring our attention to the short-term and long-term challenges we are facing. During the last few years, the conservation status of most species and habitats protected under the EU law has improved only a little. We are still far from halting the loss of biodiversity in the EU. But we need to find ways how to get there. In the light of the upcoming Biodiversity Strategy review, we have to be honest and assess how to match the targets with actions. Now there is online public consultation going on. It gives a possibility for all involved to reflect what has happened since the adoption of the strategy and to point out our success and lessons learned. Critical views are welcome as well. This will help us to do more and become more efficient to protect our natural heritage. Preservation of biological diversity and ecosystems is critical to sustain our economy and maintain human well-being over time. During the informal Environmental Council in Riga, I have reminded to the Ministers for Environment and Ministers of Energy that the natural capital is an important aspect to be considered in any economic development. Ladies and gentlemen, these two recently published reports provide a unique knowledge base. It allows us and the next presidencies to steer the process towards better informed policy making. Let me stress that it's also essential to raise public awareness about the environment. It is important to get the message across various stakeholders. Therefore, I am glad that there was huge interest about participation in this conference. Besides intensive working sessions, you will also have a wonderful opportunity to take part in the Nature Concert Hall. This public awareness event is a winner of the Green Spider Network in 2012. It is important to find attractive ways to communicate environmental issues to the public. In conclusion, I wish you very fruitful and active discussions throughout both days and many interesting sessions, and enjoy the Nature Concert Hall tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And he is excusing himself, for he has to leave. But maybe it is a good time that I introduce myself as well. I am Alda Ozola, Deputy State Secretary at the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Regional Development, Latvia, responsible for all environmental issues, so including nature and biodiversity as well. And I've been asked by my colleagues both to give the perspective in the beginning of the presidency on how we see today the conference, and then how do we see the role of biodiversity in presidency's agenda. And I will also have the pleasure to moderate the first part until the coffee break. So let me turn to the topic of biodiversity, and why did we as Latvian presidency chose, or how do we see it fitting into our work program. It is one of the priorities that we chose to focus from the area of our ministry. And of course, the reason, one of the biggest reasons, is the fact that this year we expect a midterm review of EU Biodiversity Strategy. And we will hear more about how it is planned and then how Commission sees it from Francois a bit later this morning. So we saw that process happening. We also knew that several important reports are due to come out, and by now they are already published, and the most recent one being State of Nature report that Ronan will also tell us more about it, because maybe not everyone is familiar with that, although I expect that in this audience most of you know about its findings, and they are not exactly a secret anymore. Also State of Environment report was about to come out, and of course it also touches partly the aspects of nature and biodiversity, and this is a report that comes out every 5 years. So these all coincidences or the facts that these reports were to be published also made us to choose to focus quite a lot on biodiversity aspects. Well, nevertheless, I also should mention, and here I think Jeremy also would have something to comment, because we heard from a number of NGOs some fears that the refit process might lead to weakening, possibly, of nature protection legislation in the EU, also in light of the work program of the new Commission. So there were all these different aspects or to consider that made us choose to take on board biodiversity and the broader natural capital agenda quite seriously in our presidency work. Besides that, there are some also, if you look from the how it fits in the broader scene, besides especially focused events, how it fits into the program and work stream of the European Commission and related institutions. Of course, there is European semester process and also the review of the EU 2020 strategy was to come out. Originally, it was scheduled to come out during our presidency time. Now we know that it is postponed and is very likely to be started in the autumn, late autumn this year. So we thought that also in light of those processes, we should look whether there are ways how to put natural capital or give natural capital more prominent role in light of economic growth and economic development. As we could see that so far the natural capital has been to a large extent, well, not probably neglected, but if the discussions start about economic growth, it tends to be kind of, the role of it tends to be seen as rather minimal or quite the opposite, that protecting nature actually costs more and it does not contribute to economic growth. So we were willing to counter probably or see whether there is a way to counter this view and what do environmental ministers have to say about all that. Also, this year was the year when so-called Juncker's package was announced with 315 billion of investment planned, and we wanted to see whether there is also space for some nature projects to be financed, the ones that also could contribute to economic growth. So there are really many aspects that led to choosing biodiversity as one of key topics for our ministry to work on. So how it looks now, if we get to the second stage, because we are already in second half of our presidency. Actually, it's a bit more than only 1 month left. The time has been flying, although many intensive meetings, but still, we have already passed most of it. And probably to mention some of the most important events related and processes related to biodiversity and natural capital agenda. So one of them is the Informal Environmental Council that Minister Gerhards also mentioned in his introductory remarks, because that council was mostly devoted to discuss these issues, the biodiversity and natural capital agenda, looking what are the challenges and what are the opportunities for better integration, for financing, and what is the long-term outlook. Of course, by the time that the Informal Environmental Council took place here in this very building in the middle of April, the State of Nature report was not out that time, but we had State of Environment report that also gave some alarming messages, if I may call them that way. Well, the report recognized that Natura 2000 has really played an important role in preserving biodiversity, and it is a backbone of biodiversity protection in European Union, and that birds and habitats directives are largely working, although there are some failures with implementation and drawbacks. However, the long-term trends and the picture, or this long-term outlook, was not looking very positive. So there were some positive achievements and in the shorter term and results, but it also indicated the need to do much more and put some more efforts. And so we wanted to hear from ministers on what their views are. Also knowing that there have been quite a rotation of ministers of environment in Europe over the last few years, so and ministers didn't have a chance to discuss these biodiversity and nature capital issues too much before. So that was a really useful and an interesting discussion. We did have some fears in the beginning or before the event that we might get some messages from ministers that they would rather prefer economic growth over natural capital, that there would be this contradiction made. But to our positive surprise, most ministers stressed the importance of protecting natural capital, the need to do more. They also pointed out to some good positive examples, because we had also a separate session of looking at how to integrate biodiversity in sectoral policies. Of course, the common agriculture policy and common fisheries policy is kind of never-ending story, or how to phrase it better, that there are always constant challenges despite many positive also improvements lately, and then we have to see how the implementation goes. But overall, these messages were very positive. There were also separate discussion and meetings between ministers of environment and ministers of energy on the second day of the informal council, and this was also probably a first time when ministers protecting biodiversity and ministers trying to develop more renewable energy have been together, and we were also not sure how this combination would work out, but we're also quite happy about the outcome, and you will have a chance to hear about results and conclusions from that session a bit later today, when my colleague from Ministry of Economy will come here also to tell about their views, how they see nature protection fitting in their plans and ambitions to go for more renewable energy, because so far it has often, or it has caused some conflict, and we should try to see how to avoid that, knowing that the renewable energy is on the growing side in the EU. It has to do with the broader climate change mitigation policy. So these were all different aspects that we discussed, and ministers had a good chance to exchange their views. We also had a good discussion during lunch on the new natural capital financing facility presented by the European Investment Bank. It is a new instrument that, well, everybody has been talking about it during the last couple of years, it seems, and now it finally started working. It was a bit too early still to see what kind of projects are coming in, but ministers in their discussion pointed out to some concerns, and I hope that we can have a more discussion about that today as well, because it of course comes to the issue: how do we finance the natural capital, preservation of it, and biodiversity? That is an issue that surfaces in most of the discussions. If we recognize that there have been failures in implementation, then financing often comes as a question on how to do that. There have been recognition that LIFE instrument has worked and it has been very successful, but there was also a notion that probably more different approaches should be found. So I think I should come slowly to end of my monologue here, and let me turn to the probably a third part on what do we expect from this conference today here. Well, first of all, and I think this is a message primarily going to Francois and other colleagues from DG Environment, that we want to see it as part of the public consultation process on that would fit into the midterm review, and also to be considered in the refit process. And therefore, I encourage you to be very, very honest and open, and really share your views with full honesty, and give also some suggestions on how we can do it better. Probably, yeah. Well, we do welcome critique, and I think Francois as well appreciates it, but we also would look or encourage you to think of some ideas on how we can overcome the hurdles that have been so far. So to try to balance the critics with a positive message. From the side of presidency, we will prepare a presidency summary. Also, there are colleagues taking notes from presentations and also discussions later on. So there are 2 full days ahead of us. So I think there will be many discussions, and we will try to write down most important messages. I think I will stop here now, and now about some, well, a bit of the housekeeping rules for the first session, because we have time until coffee break, which is to start at 11. And if there is something fixed in stone, that is coffee break, because we only have half an hour. If we miss it, there is no chance to return it or postpone it. So please, that is my invitation for those who will give presentations, for the speakers, to stay in time. And the way we will want to organize it is that we will not give a slot for questions and question-answer sessions after each presentation, but please keep your questions for a bit later, and we hope that there is a chance to have it before the coffee break. So if you want to have a chance to ask questions, please keep them a while, and otherwise there will be also later on in the evening, we expect some more time for discussions. But I recognize that it might be also willingness to ask straight away something after the presenters. Okay, I think I will finally stop here, and I will invite Ronan Uhel from European Environmental Agency, who is head of a program for natural system and vulnerabilities. And I have to say, Ronan very much helped us in preparations also for the informal environmental council, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm standing here before you today to really speak about what we know. And the main topic, of course, sounds like the state of nature, but states of nature, I would like to link it to notion like natural capital. I would like to link it to biological diversity. I would like to link it to ecosystems and the services. There is a terminology which is growing in our policy arenas, which I think is very important. And this is what I would like to really go through, give a sort of big picture. Where do we stand? And the knowledge has to do with the fact that in 2015, this is definitely the year of knowledge. Thousands of experts throughout the countries have been mobilized to help really draw a European assessment across the environmental issues. And we came up with a number of products, and I would like to share with you conclusions which are very much related indeed to the state of nature to this regard. This knowledge is available to all of you, and this knowledge is structured in a number of products, so that to give you really an indication of environment in Europe from also a global perspective, because there is no environment in Europe today which is not related to global issues, global trends, global interactions. So to this effect, you will find information about different dimensions of this globalized world and what it means in terms of interdependencies, interactions with Europe's environment. For the European per se, there will be a number of briefings crossing the different environmental issues, from water to biodiversity to ecosystems to air to health to green economy. To help also the reading of the state of the environment in Europe, we have also provided a number of cross-country comparisons, as well as very specific briefings for countries and particular regions in Europe. So, in providing this picture, it is clear that we came up with a number of overarching conclusions of 3 years of efforts trying to really not only observe but analyze and let alone then at the end assess the environmental quality and environmental status throughout Europe and the reasons why we are in the situation we are in. And there are 4 overarching key conclusions which I think will resonate very well as well with what we are going to debate more closely in a few minutes when it comes to nature per se. So first and foremost is that in Europe we have an amazing indeed set of policies, and everybody will go on and recognize that, but at the same time what we are more and more recognizing is that these policies, when well conducted and fully implemented, they do deliver. So the main issue might not be about, indeed, are we lacking on policies? Clearly, the main message, which is one that we have been knowing for quite a while, is that we have a lack of implementation. And in particular, through the implementation, a lack of consistency, i.e. policy coherence, when it comes to actions. And the main reasons for that is because, yes, environmental issues are more and more, and certainly today, definitely systemic in their nature. Everything connects, and even more than before. And this systemic dimension is also connected to what I said earlier on. There is a huge global dimension to it. And of course, everybody would think immediately about climate change, but it's much more than that. It has to do with management of natural resources overall. Has to do with dependency we have in terms of different products and benefits that we need in Europe. So all of that means that we are definitely tackling here something which is highly complex, highly unstable, because it has to do with very, very complicated systems from production to consumption and the way we link the two. So what we are indeed facing is something which is very holistic, something which we need indeed that we think in terms of acting on these systems in a way that is to say we need a transformation. We need the transition towards indeed systems that will be much more sustainable, systems that will be indeed much more recognizing the dependencies they have towards natural capital. So we have, at the same time, when stated all of that, it is clear that in Europe today we have major opportunities in terms of the design of, in particular, a number of social and economic policies to really boost our ability and our response towards managing our environment and our natural capital much better than we are doing today. And it will go through, indeed, being much smarter when it comes to innovation, and will be more greener when it comes to economy and employment policies. And all of that is captured very well in the overarching goal of the 7th EAP, and this is very much what we have done for 2.5 years, analyzing systematically what can be observed, what can be analyzed, what can be stated, what do we know about the fact that indeed we would like to move toward a circular economy where natural resources are managed sustainably, where biodiversity is fully protected, valued, and restored in ways that enhance our society's resilience. So all of that is what we have been studying and trying to capture the essentials in main blocks of analysis. And the first one is very much what we are going to address this morning, because this is the objective. And the fact that it has been captured under this labeling of natural capital is not therefore, I would say, by default. It is something which is very forceful in its understanding and its policy conceptualization. We are indeed looking at a number of assets, flows, benefits, services that we all depend when it comes to maintaining our society's resilience and when it comes to developing the economy. So what is clear in that context is that as per the second session this morning, we'll be hearing that resource efficiency, yes, there are some improvements, but they are not translating indeed into maintaining ecosystem and social resilience. And there are many reasons for that, which we can explore a bit later on. So we are definitely in a systemic dimension. We have to look at things from a holistic perspective. This is awfully complex, this is awfully uncertain, but at the same time, that is definitely the only way to move ahead. And under the Italian presidency, for instance, there was a very, very fascinating conference understanding that we need to link natural capital and cultural capital, for instance. But the understandings are indeed developing pretty rapidly in linking the different capitals that we manage and which we depend on. And the difficulty today is to see how we go about organizing our systems, our policies, so to address that in a very, very, I would say, connecting manner. And to do it, primarily comes the financial capital. And there will be discussions during this conference about mobilizing finances for biodiversity and natural capital. Are we being effective there? Do we have the right approach? Do we have the right methods? Conceptualizing indeed issues like valuation of nature is something which is very complex because it's not all about economics, for instance. So there are a number of issues which we would have to look at, and in order to do that, we have to see ourselves very much joining and being a full integrative part of what should be the overall policy framework, where clearly, if we are very serious about developing towards a new form of economy, then we have to understand that there are definitely very, very basic dependencies. And as you can see, the main envelope for that has to do with the natural capital, the ecosystem resilience, their ability indeed to be productive and to deliver services that we depend on. And this is something that has been analyzed thoroughly, and for the time being, just indicating that we are far from this realization today. It's only for the time being the result of an assessment. It's not at all the result of an effectiveness analysis. So, from the perspective of the 7th EAP, from the perspective of the biodiversity strategy, this is what we are all here to talk about and see how we are performing in Europe when it comes to maintaining, protecting, enhancing our capital, and so we can indeed keep on tapping on many benefits that ecosystems are there to deliver. And the point is that overall there is a growing cumulative pressure over our ecosystems, meaning that their productivity is going down. And this is worrying. And so we will need to look at that. And when we'll be looking at state of nature per se, we'll have some elements of explanation why we are in that situation. When talking about indeed policy coherence, policy implementation, well, I guess there will be many sessions this morning and tomorrow linking indeed nature-based issues to economic sectors, energy, agriculture, land use overall, and we will see there that for the time being, what is very much lacking indeed is a coherent integration approach. We are still much behind. And it is absolutely obvious as well that for the time being, the mismanagement that we can observe and analyze of natural capital throughout Europe is also based because we are missing some basics. And among these basics is that we are not at all, for the time being, in a position to value thoroughly and functionally this natural capital. So when it comes to socioeconomic policies, we are lagging behind because there is no recognition of this particular dimension that natural capital provides to grow well-being, welfare. So it will start, as per one of the objectives of the biodiversity strategy, to start accounting indeed for our natural capital. Very few countries, very few businesses are doing so, which again is a basic. So with that in mind, going to the heart of the matter, i.e. status, what do we observe? Well, when it comes to the natural capital, you have here the sort of comprehensive picture from terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity to marine and coastal biodiversity to climate change impacts and ecological status of freshwater bodies. And you will see indeed a dominant red and orange-yellow color, meaning that we are definitely either in a sort of deterioration in many issues, or a very, very mixed picture where clearly, I would say, situation is not as good as it should. And this element is very much based on what we have observed factually for the past 5-10 years, and what we are able to project, looking at some trajectories and using some scenario-based approaches, and then projecting ourselves towards the next 20 years or so. And this is where we can observe that indeed it would appear that if we are not serious about implementing these natural capital-based policies, then we will be remaining in that situation that we know today. So, needless to say that this is indeed an important policy area, the biodiversity strategy, where everything is brought together in a sort of very comprehensive, articulated approach, where we have provided ourselves with explicit targets and really indicating in which policy domains, arenas, things we need to improve. But I leave that for Francois to speak very thoroughly about it. Because today, yes, it is absolutely clear what was stated by the strategy now almost 5 years ago remains. Biodiversity loss is still upon us, and it is a massive concern that we need to look after and bend the trend. So biodiversity loss, indeed, as we can see it now in the result of the assessments that we have conducted and delivered through the State of Nature exercise, which is based on the reporting from the Habitats and Birds Directive. I put up this some elements for you to really understand that it is absolutely a unique exercise, a unique undertaking that we have just achieved there. Thousands of experts throughout the countries, providing more than 17,000 data sets on individual species and habitats, allowing indeed then to go and analyze status of around 450 wild bird species, 230 habitat types, and more than 1,200 other species of European importance. And all of that, of course, whilst developing methodologies that would have to be coherent, that would have to be extremely functional, so we can indeed deliver a picture which is very, very consistent across the board. And the fact that for the very first time in the world, you have such an assessment for both habitat and species, which is also looking at different times, because there we have also things we can compare to a certain extent with the previous exercise for the Habitats Directive 6 years back. So a massive exercise which unfortunately is providing a number of poor messages, but with some good news. And the principal, I would say, good news has to do with the Birds Directive when it comes to the status of wild birds in Europe, where we can see that we have a majority indeed of bird species which are in a secure state. And the fact that we have also we have gotten much more information, so the unknown decreased. But at the same time, looking at near threatened and threatened, we still have a proportion which is very high. However, I think there is indication here that the situation is slightly improving, and that we have some direct effects when it comes to implementing that particular directive, plus all the connects policy interventions. But somehow it seems that it is easier to work and to maintain and to help birds population than it is to really act upon habitats. Because if we look at the assessments under the Habitats Directive for both habitat and species, then the situation is indeed much more worrying, where the vast majority is more in terms of unfavorable status. So no much difference compared to what we were able to analyze 6-7 years back. And there are many reasons for that, which we are going to come in a minute, but this is the main outcome of the analysis. And underneath this very, very synoptic representation, you have hundreds and hundreds of pages of descriptions looking at the different habitat types, looking at the different species, etc. And you can read that in the State of Nature brochure, you can read that in the technical report of the EEA. You have really a massive information at your fingertip there that you can thoroughly, I would say, go through and get an understanding of why are we in this situation today. So when it comes to the target, I'm not going to spend much time on it. That will be part of the next intervention as well. But here, it's, I think, enough to say that there has been no significant change for habitat types. That's absolutely clear. Meaning that assessments which were previously determined as favorable remain so, and no additional habitats achieve favorable conservation status. Even 4% now are assessed as unfavorable, but improving, which is good, but 30% are still deteriorating. For the species, the situation looks kind of okay, i.e. on track, but if we would indeed look at some methodological underpinning when it came to determining the target a couple of years back and doing a bit of backcasting, we would see that a sort of more adequate target that many species which would have been assessed as favorable in 27 will not be so today. So that's really the overall indication, with a number of then I would say, policy readings around that, and those that you have here on the slide are those stemming from the composite report of the European Commission. And I think they are important to highlight because they are going to really give me an entry to the next few slides I have through this presentation. Another way to look at it is indeed to get this very, very clear picture in mind in terms of unfavorable, deteriorating and stable for both habitat and species and the relation to the unknown. And then you will see that indeed the proportions are unfortunately still very high. So the analysis can continue. As I said, you can really read that for particular habitats of European interest and see trends and potentially compare, where you will see that, for instance, when it comes to grasslands, the situation remains very, very worrying compared to few habitats where we may say that there are indeed a number of improvements. The same analysis can be done for species, and then you can go even into more details. But overall, it is clear that the picture is very fragmented, because when it comes to particular progress, positive progress, it is indeed in very, very specific domains for very, very few habitats and a particular species. So member states, when reporting, indicating clearly that there are a number of reasons why nature is under tremendous pressures, and these pressures indeed impacting quite significantly on the quality and the overall functioning of nature. And those elements are no news for any of us in the room. We know them very well. Those are indeed pressures that we have been identifying and trying to act upon for ages. But we put that in a sort of synoptic representation when it comes to then drivers and pressures and their impacts on ecosystems, taking the classification that we have developed at the European level through the MASS initiative. And then the main point, this is really what we have to really pay attention to. Because there are one important item here, which is we need indeed to look at the set of pressures altogether. We cannot really just put our heads and say, okay, we are going to address climate change. Oh, no. We better address pollution and nutrient enrichment because this is something which is even of more relevance. No. We have really to think through and we have to say, okay, but all these different pressures, they have origins in particular activities that need to be really tackled, I would say, cohesively. Because we cannot address overexploitation if we are not looking indeed at a number of issues related to habitat changes. We cannot address climate change if we are not looking at the origin of pollution, etc., etc. So this picture is just to indicate that it is absolutely an issue of looking at the activities, human activities as a whole, and the need to address that through systemic responses. And this picture is also indicative of one fact, is that there are very few domains where we can expect a decrease of pressures. And this is indeed what makes the job even more complicated and pressing. And when you go through, which I'm not going to do now, you can indeed pinpoint at a number of key problems. And the conference will address many of those one by one. But let's keep in mind that we cannot disconnect one particular issue from another. And this is what makes things indeed complex, i.e. systemic. So, coming to conclusions, we have looked indeed at the status. At the same time, in terms of communication, it is indeed pretty difficult because when you communicate to policymakers that the situation is not as good as you would expect, using a very diplomatic language, then at the same time you have to indicate that there is a value into protecting and maintaining and enhancing biological diversity. So we need indeed to come more to the fore with some of the important news as well. That is to say, to translate into some evidence the benefits that we all depend on when it comes to the ecosystems and their services. And a number of analyses, a number of studies have been done, but we need to speak really the language of society. We need to speak the language of growth. We need to speak the language of economy. And this is something which is at our doorstep. That's something that we need to make the step for. This is absolutely necessary. So, we have indeed, from this communication perspective, we can show some results which are much more positive. But at the same time, we know that we have an overarching issue, which is to say that we are not on track to fully deliver on the targets, i.e. when it comes to the collective performance on managing nature, we have a deficit. So that we need to again hammer this issue of further implementation, better implementation, coherent implementation, from the local to the European level. And the fact that if we want to do that, we need to do that with that particular vision in mind. That is to say that, well, it's all about our ecosystem's resilience. Because if we want to really not only secure tomorrow, we have also to think of securing the longer future. And in order to do that, it goes by indeed this core objective, maintaining, enhancing, protecting the natural capital. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ronan, for especially for staying also within the time limit, and indeed quite grim the picture. At least that is how it sounds. But I think it was also very, very valuable that you pointed to the complex nature and the matrix of various trends and issues. And but as I mentioned in the beginning, we try to keep the time for some questions just before the coffee break. And now I would like to invite Mr. Francois Wakenhut from DG Environment, whom you might know also very well, who is head of unit of biodiversity there, and he will tell us about what European Commission plans in terms of EU biodiversity strategy midterm review, and how it could help perhaps to address the issues that Ronan was speaking about.
Thank you very much, Alda. Good morning, dear colleagues. I would want to start by thanking the Latvian Presidency again for making today's event possible. You mentioned yourself that there has been a continuum with the informal council, with this conference today, which is also fully registered as part of the Green Week process of consultations on the natural capital year. And I can only confirm that this is indeed going to make a very useful contribution to the consultation process towards the midterm review and on refit work. So we're very grateful to you for making today's event possible. And our expectations about it are as high as yours. So I'm sure that we'll face very interesting and challenging sets of discussions and questions, and we look forward to that. I will indeed try and present the overall outlook on the midterm review of the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2020. The review itself is planned for October. We want to have it on the table of the Council by then, so as to make it possible for the Luxembourgish presidency to take over from the Latvian presidency and take us through a very important set of conclusions in December that will set the overall priorities for the remainder of the implementing period. Let's start with the big picture. The big picture, I think, is best summarized by the work on planetary boundaries. Many of you will be familiar with this research project, which has basically now been on for 6 years. There was a first publication in 2009, and the latest update was provided earlier this year. And as you can see from this slide, biodiversity is one of the most threatened areas when it comes to areas on which we have crossed the planetary boundaries. The safety zones have not been respected. Basically, we've gotten beyond those safety zones, and here it's referred to as biosphere integrity, and the picture is certainly not a joyful one, and that is for the global level, of course, but we can certainly see some similarities with the situation that we're facing at EU level. So I think that it's useful to start from this, because the picture was actually quite grim back in 2009 as well, when the first planetary boundaries exercise was developed. So there's been no significant improvement in that regard. But we also need to look at the short implementation period that we've had between 2010-11 and 2015 now in assessing the progress that we've made. I'll come back to that, but I think that this is a very important point to bear in mind. We're not looking at curbing a trend which has been bad for a number of decades. We're looking at what we've done over the past 4 or 5 years. At the EU level, the starting point to the biodiversity strategy was the so-called EU 2010 biodiversity baseline, which will be very familiar to most of you, and certainly to Ronan and the colleagues from the agency that heavily contributed to making it possible. And that was the best picture we could draw at the time of the preparation of the strategy, based on the limited knowledge that we had in certain areas. And I think that you've certainly heard from Ronan that the knowledge picture has improved dramatically over the past 5 years, even though a number of challenges remain. But the picture that we had in 2010 is, as you know, it was, and that was certainly not one that was particularly positive in terms of the overall state of biodiversity in Europe, whether we were looking at species, habitats, or ecosystems as a whole. To the extent that we could, the picture was not a satisfactory one, and that was the main justification for the prioritization process that we established for the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2020. In the meantime, we've looked at how the picture has evolved from 2010 to 2015. Some of the slides here you've seen already. In particular, the first one, top left, was in Ronan's presentation. So we will come back to that during the course of today and tomorrow's discussion, so I won't dwell on those, but I will just give a sense of the fact that the situation does remain a concerning one when it comes to the trends since 2010. Now, let's move on to the policy framework. The midterm review will consist of 2 parts. There will be a so-called policy report, which will be a synthesis of progress that will also look at the barriers and gaps for reaching the 2020 objectives, and this will be a document which the College of Commissioners will adopt, will endorse. This is something that will go through the full cycle of policy approval inside the Commission. The second part will be a number of background documents, and those background documents will not go through formal consultations. They will be put online on our Biodiversity Information System for Europe, on BIS, and the main components will be, obviously the state of nature is already out and will not be adopted a second time, but it will certainly be a very relevant piece of information about how we've done, and you've heard a lot about it now. We will also have a very thorough technical assessment of EU progress since 2011 and an overall status of Member States' progress based on Member States' 5th national reports, completed with some information that we've received from Member States on top of it, and for which we're very grateful. Moving on to a sketchy assessment per target. I mean, as you will appreciate, all this work is still work in progress, so it's not really possible to draw any conclusions yet in terms of the policy orientations we will take in the midterm review. But what I can give you is a preview of the overall picture as emerging from the information that is available. I won't really dwell in details in the sense that we will obviously be going through a very extensive process of consultations with all our colleagues across the Commission over the coming weeks, which may have an impact on how some messages will be communicated and how some priorities will be assessed. Target 1, you already got a number of clarifications from Ronan about the overall picture, and this slide is simply aimed at illustrating what the broader presentation you received from Ronan already told you. I think that one of the important elements there that we need to look at is obviously that while the overall status of species and habitats has remained relatively stable over the last 6 years, there have been some significant improvements at local and regional levels. And again, that is the link that I want to make about the time available for the assessment, 4 or 5 years, and we need to look at the progress that has been made over that time period. What is very clear as well is that in terms of the actions, and I'll come back to that in more detail for the Nature Directors meeting that will have another presentation on the midterm review, what is also very clear is that on the actions, whenever the EU level is concerned, we feel that there's been significant delivery on what was announced in the strategy, which is positive in terms of our capacity to demonstrate that we were basically faithful to our words back in 2010-11. What's also clear, though, is that unless we step up significantly the pace of implementation, and Ronan said this, we will not deliver on target 1. So we can do it, but in order to do it, we need to considerably step up the pace of implementation, and that is clearly going to be one of the priorities for the incoming period. Moving on to target 2, well, I would say that the picture is quite concerning there in some respects as well. We have seen grasslands and wetlands which have the highest proportion of habitats with an unfavorable, bad and deteriorating status. You also got an introduction into that through Ronan in the presentation just before me. In terms of ecosystem services, we haven't seen much change since 2010. We've seen increasing trends of some provisioning services and a decrease of services directly related to biodiversity, such as pollination. So when it comes to regulating services, I would say that the picture remains as dire as it was before, which is not to say that we've been ineffective. Again, if we look at what's been initiated since 2010-11, there's a lot there that will contribute to improving the picture. If we think, for instance, at the work on mass or green infrastructure, but all of this will need to, again, be upscaled significantly when it comes to green infrastructure work. And when it comes to mass, well, it will need to be completed in the first place, but it will also need to be followed by decision-making that fully reflects the picture of our ecosystems and the services they provide, which is far from being the case today. Moving on to target 3, on agriculture and forestry. This is an area where the situation is certainly of concern. We've seen continuous and continuing decline in the status of forest and agriculture-related species and habitats, and of grassland in particular. Again, you got an illustration of this excuse me, in Ronan's presentation. When it comes to farmland birds and grassland butterflies, which are very good proxies for the overall state of biodiversity in agricultural ecosystems, they're still declining, and the pace of that decline may have stabilized a bit, but if we look at the overall losses over the past 30 years, I think there is no reason for satisfaction there. On the contrary. So this is clearly, in terms of state, one of the areas that is most challenging for the remainder of the implementation period of the biodiversity strategy. And that, of course, raises questions for us in the Commission in terms of the overall policy orientations of the related frameworks that are in place and the way in which they have been used fully or not. When I think about the menu options that we have under the reformed CAP, that raises interesting questions for the remainder of the implementation period. Moving on to Target 4 and the marine environment and fisheries. When it comes to the state of the picture, a majority of EU-assessed fish stocks remain overexploited. The EU will not deliver on MSY by 2015 for all stocks. We will deliver on MSY by 2015 for some stocks, but we will not deliver on it for all stocks, which, by the way, is now in line with the CFP reform. As you know, in the biodiversity strategy, as adopted and reviewed by the Council and the Parliament in 2011, we had a 2015 MSY objective, but that has been altered by the reform of the CFP. So the framework now is, of course, based on the CFP itself as adopted by the Council and the Parliament, and that leaves some room for MSY to be achieved for all stocks beyond 2015. 4% of marine habitats and species have achieved good environmental status under the MSFD, but 80% remain unknown. And I mean, there I would want to draw your attention to the hugely unsatisfactory picture when it comes to the lack of knowledge. Our knowledge of the marine environment remains much too insufficient for us to be able to assess properly where we stand. And this is one of the core knowledge gaps that we have to address if we are serious about protecting the marine environment. So this is clearly one of the areas where we need to considerably step up our efforts at all levels, EU, national, but also global level, if we are to be in a position to really say how we are delivering. Only 9% of marine habitats and 7% of marine species are in favorable conservation status. Again, this is an illustration of the magnitude of the challenge ahead, but there are considerable knowledge gaps which need to be taken into consideration in putting those figures into perspectives. Considerable increase in Natura 2000 designation in the marine, but still important gaps. So I think that the picture for the marine environment is one of considerable gaps that need to be addressed in the first place, and when it comes to the overall status, we're not there, clearly. But at the same time, and I'm not going to dwell on actions so much in this presentation, but we've got the right framework in place. We believe that the CFP framework is the right one. It's balanced. It's very much based on a sound scientific approach that puts ecosystems first. So we think that the recipe is there for us to deliver. The question is the pace of implementation again, and the extent to which we will also fill the knowledge gaps without which we will not be able to assess properly where we are. Moving on to invasive species. Invasive species is going to be a story which will be happy in terms of what we've achieved on paper, I would say. But when it comes to the picture in terms of making a difference on the ground, of course, it's going to be too soon to judge whether we'll be delivering, because that will very much depend on the way in which the regulation that was adopted last year and entered into force in January will be developed and monitored at the national level. We are in the process of developing a first list of IAS of union concern, as many of you will know. This is on track to be adopted by the committee in charge later this year. So by the end of 2015, our objective is to have a fully operational system through the regulation, and the first trade bans in particular kicking for any of the species that will feature on the Union list. Now, in terms of challenges ahead, apart from the implementation picture, we have a major problem with the Ballast Water Convention, which is still not yet ratified. I don't know if you noticed when Ronan was presenting to you the overall picture on basically the different drivers per issue, you could see that for invasive species, the marine environment was one of the particularly problematic areas. It was red, and red on the increase. Well, ballast water is certainly one of the main reasons why this is so. So the fact that only 4 EU member states have ratified the Ballast Water Convention up to date, 4 out of 28, is, I think, a very problematic picture. Those 4 are doing their utmost to deliver on the Ballast Water Convention, but we've got 24 member states that are not there yet. We are getting very close in terms of the overall pace of ratification to the entry into force of the convention, but if I can put it that way, it's not thanks to a majority of EU member states, which I think is regrettable. So maybe a gesture that could usefully be made in the natural capital years to really step up the efforts on the side of all to make sure that the Ballast Water Convention becomes operational. This is a major tool if we are to deliver on invasive species and on the overall state of the marine environment. So this is a priority. Just to give an illustration which I think will take us close to the reality on the ground, which some of the member states are very familiar with the extension of the Suez Canal, which is happening and happening very fast thanks to a lot of Middle Eastern funding. We will soon be faced with many more invasions, and if we do not tackle this challenge, I think that the whole Eastern Mediterranean ecosystems will be at risk of significant damage. So this is certainly something on which we need to do better. Newly emerging concerns, I'll simply say that there is an issue in the increase in wildlife disease and release of alien macroorganisms for biological control. This may seem very technical, but this is a main source of new problems which we need to tackle. And on this, there is some optimism in the sense that we're reviewing our plant and animal health regimes in the EU right now, and the package will be made fully consistent across the board, so hopefully we'll be more effective in tackling this challenge. Moving on to the 6th and last target, helping to avert global biodiversity loss. There, the picture is one of certainly progress on the resource mobilization side. The EU is by far the largest donor for biodiversity. We've made considerable progress in increasing our resources for global biodiversity over the past 4 years, in keeping up with our global commitments. But of course, we cannot rest on our laurels there. We need to step up the pace of delivery on this funding and make sure that it's not put at risk by a review of priorities. As we know, there are competing priorities when it comes to development aid, and we need to make sure that biodiversity is not going to be going down the drain. And for this to happen, I do believe that the SDG picture, which is unfolding in the coming months, and as you know, for now we've got 2 relevant SDGs for biodiversity on oceans and terrestrial ecosystems. If we can keep those in, this will be a key element to make sure that funding will continue to follow in the years to come and reflect the essential contribution ecosystems make to food security, to development as a whole. We've taken initial steps to reduce indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, including wildlife trade. There's been a lot of focus on wildlife trade over the past few months, which is very positive, and we're certainly doing more and more to tackle this challenge, which is something that will contribute to the global picture. On the less satisfactory side, the EU 28 footprint is still above its biocapacity. It's actually twice its biocapacity, so the picture there is also one that should, I think, lead to some reflections in-house about how we can improve the picture. This is very much linked to the circular economy, resource efficiency work, which is there to bring us back to a path of sustainable consumption and production. And the least we can say is that there's more to do in this area. A big source of satisfaction is the fact that we have ratified the Nagoya Protocol. We were among the first ones to do so, and we have a new regulation in place that will make us deliver and make sure that we tackle this important target of ours. I'll move on to a few horizontal issues before closing. Financing first. Further integrating biodiversity aspects into key EU financing instruments remains a core priority. And on this, the priority is to seize the existing opportunities we have. I've alluded to the CAP earlier. The CAP does offer a menu approach when it comes to some of the rural development programs approach, for instance, and there's a lot of potential there, provided that the right decisions are made in terms of measures that are taken. So this is an appeal to make sure that this is done in the maximal possible way. We also need to look at new tools and approaches while recognizing that most of the funding in terms of sheer numbers and magnitude will continue to come from the CAP and certainly other structural policies such as the regional policy, but also research funding from Horizon 2020. We need to look at new tools and approaches. Two new tools that I will briefly mention: the NCFF, the Natural Capital Financing Facility. Alda mentioned it because this was discussed at the informal council and we were very grateful for that. Indeed, it's too soon to tell what this will actually deliver because the project pipeline is now being developed, but we hope that within the next 2-3 months we will be able to show some concrete projects that will be taken further on the ground and deliver on core issues such as payments for ecosystem services, green infrastructure, adaptation through ecosystem-based approaches. So I think that the potential is there. We've heard some of the concerns about the fact that this could be also attracting some investors that would not be primarily focused on biodiversity, but I can really assure all that the Commission is absolutely determined to make sure that this instrument delivers fully for biodiversity, even if the point is also to demonstrate that we can make a business case for investments in biodiversity, which I think you will all agree is important if we are to convince about the need for biodiversity funding to be expanded through other sources of funding. Tracking biodiversity-related financing in the EU budget, this is brand new and this is work in the making. We're now applying it for the first time. This will certainly be a learning by doing process because the methodologies are being refined, but for the first time we'll be able to document and trace and track all the funding that goes or is set to go to biodiversity, ex ante and ex post, and I think that this will be a significantly improved picture for us to be able to assess whether we're delivering or not on our financing commitments for biodiversity at EU, but also at global level. So this is something that we very much welcome, and we know that some member states are engaged in similar work at the national level, and we can only encourage others to follow suit if they haven't yet done so. Partnerships. We've put a lot of emphasis on partnerships over the past 5 years because we believe that this is one of the conditions through which we can deliver more with the limited resources we all have. And we also believe that we need to work with constituencies that are not always seen as core constituencies on the natural capital agenda. So I'll give 5 illustrations of this. Cooperation has been enhanced through the Natura 2000 biogeographical process. This has been a big success in terms of involvement for all stakeholders, and certainly a lot of gratitude on our side to the member states that have lent their hands to make this happen, together with all stakeholders that have contributed to this process. Hugely successful. Awareness raising through Natura 2000 award scheme. The award was awarded a couple days ago on the 21st, and again, I think that this has been a very successful process to reward those that are doing best and attract more recognition for what is excellent work on the ground. Engagement of private sector in the business and biodiversity platform, over 200 members now, among which many of the leading European companies in their sectors, as well as a wealth of SMEs. So this connects very closely to the overall growth and innovation agenda, something that we very much welcome. Overseas partnership through the BEST initiative, which tackles all our overseas and outermost regions, which are biodiversity hotspots. So this is something that has also delivered significantly, and we're very pleased that this is now captured fully in the overall funding program of our colleagues from Development Cooperation. and last but not least, TEEB, the work on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, which has really expanded at national and sector as well as country outside the European level. So this is an enterprise that is growing, and I think that this is essential to, again, continue to make the case for the socio-economic interface with nature and the fact that one cannot do without the other, at least not in the medium to long term. The knowledge base I will not dwell on because Ronan was very complete about it, but this is clearly one of the main gaps that we continue to need to address over the coming years. We've got a number of really good tools to do so. The reporting under the nature directives that has been streamlined, mass, indicator-based monitoring reporting, access to information through BIS, support from H2020, but still major gaps. So I would like that to be a motto of the day and the next day, because I think that you will see through presentations, you will hear also from our colleagues from the JRC and other institutes that this is a precondition for us to deliver on our work. I will not draw any conclusions on what we will read into the midterm review that will come in September, October, but I hope that we'll get many views, critical ones as well, constructive ones always, on the way forward. We very much count on you to guide us through this very interesting yet challenging process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois. Very, very valuable presentation indeed. And I also took some notes, and it mentions a few times gaps, because you talked about implementation gaps and, of course, knowledge gaps as well. And from moderator side, I saw some people taking pictures of snapshots or of the presentation, but we will make sure that all the presentations are sent out, distributed, so there is no need to take photos of that, but of course you are welcome to take notes, what you like. And Francois mentioned this Natura 2000 award scheme. Of course, we are a bit sad that our side did not win, but it was among the finalists, and still very good way to promote, I think, very valuable. But now I would like to invite Jeremy Wates, Secretary General of European Environmental Bureau. This is a large network of environmental organizations, quite well known, I would say. And of course, from NGOs, we often expect quite critical views. At the same time, I wonder how much more critical you can get, because both Ronan and Francois, they were also quite critical already, saying that we are still, unfortunately, quite far from where we need to be in terms of halting the loss of biodiversity by 2020 and then reaching other targets, the 6 targets. Francois said that we need to step up efforts, and I see that Jeremy's title of the presentation is that we need to double of efforts. So I don't know how much Francois meant that we need to step up efforts, but so I would invite Jeremy to share his views on what should be done.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Alda, for the words of introduction and also for your opening remarks, setting the context for this debate. And I really want to agree with you that this is a very timely topic, and to congratulate the Latvian Presidency on putting this on the agenda in the broader sense in the Informal Environment Council and as well here with this conference today. And you've mentioned, of course, that the midterm review of the biodiversity strategy as being one reason. You've also mentioned the fitness check of the nature directives and alluded to the fact that there are concerns around the framing of this fitness check. And I just want to underline that point. And those concerns come from initially the mandate that was given to Commissioner Vella, which created a very specific steer on the process by suggesting, in a way, an outcome that there should be consideration should be given to merging the directives with a view to producing a more modern piece of legislation. I think this set off a number of alarm bells. So I do believe it's very important. You've mentioned also in your introductory remarks the opportunity provided by the midterm review of the Europe 2020 strategy and the possibility to, in a way, introduce the green elements that have been so spectacularly absent from President Juncker's political guidelines that were announced even before he took up office. And those guidelines, incidentally, completely ignore environment apart from climate change and are still in place. Not one comma of them has been changed to this day, and we understand there is currently no intention to do so. On the other hand, there are possibilities to bring some green elements into Europe 2020. However, we cannot be too optimistic if we see that only 2 weeks ago, one of the potential greening instruments under Europe 2020, and I'm referring here to the European semester with the country-specific recommendations, has been actually actively degreened. It has had the environment and climate elements stripped from it, whereas in previous years there were at least some country-specific recommendations referring to a green tax shift, referring to environmentally harmful substances being removed, referring to investments in renewable energy and efficiency. There is only one this year addressed to Luxembourg which has this. So it's been, and it's very, one has to be very clear that this has come from the top levels of the Commission. So if you've come here expecting to hear a strong argument between Francois and me today, you will be disappointed because much of what he and Ronan have said, of course, we will share those opinions very closely. But at the top level, we have to, if we look at the political context for this discussion, we have to realize that we have a major problem with a Commission that has not recognized the value of the environment in general and environment and nature as well within that context. So this is part of the context, and I want to pay tribute to the two previous speakers also for putting this debate on biodiversity into a broader context with references to the planetary boundaries in the case of Francois and also referring to the need for systemic changes in the systems of production and consumption, which Ronan has mentioned, because I think it's crucial that we do see this in the broader context. Well, some of what I will be saying in this presentation may be a little bit repetitive, and I'll try to skip through those parts and really focus on our recommendations for what should be done. But first of all, I'd just like to emphasize how high the stakes are here. You will remember a few years ago when some relatively small events in relation to the world's financial system brought that system crashing down. And I think if you apply this analogy to what we're talking about today, nature, the stakes are so much higher. We're not talking about the world's financial system, we're talking about the basis for life itself as we know it. The removal of one building block in that system can have catastrophic effects. It could be a removal of a key pollinator. But the interlinked nature of the building blocks in the system makes it absolutely fundamental that we get this right. And right now we're getting it wrong. That, looking at the targets in the biodiversity strategy, you've already had a similar slide here from Ronan's presentation, so I won't dwell on it. We have the headline target, and we have then the 6 targets under that. And I would like to, in my presentation, go briefly through those 6 targets with an assessment and then some recommendations. But first of all, the recently issued State of Nature report has some highlights that are worth mentioning. The dire state of nature in Europe, only 23% of species and 16% of habitats in good status, but also that when properly protected and managed, nature can recover. We also have to recognise that our knowledge on the extent to which species and habitats are threatened has improved in many countries, and this is important if the problem is to be effectively addressed. But clearly the conclusion, I think this is shared with all of us up here on the panel today, that more effort is needed at both the EU and the national levels to effectively protect nature. So looking at the first target, you've really heard, I'm really confirming what has been said in the State of Nature reports and what has been said also by the other panelists today, that the nature directives are the main tools that ensure the conservation of nature in the EU, and that when they're properly implemented, they are effective. And this issue of implementation, I think we can't put too much emphasis on it. So I will come back to that. And here are some ideas of how we can do that. First of all, member states need to complete the designation of the Natura 2000 sites, and especially in the marine environment, and also to ensure sufficient legal protection and management for all sites. We need management plans and other management instruments for all Natura 2000 sites, and these need to be implemented as soon as possible. The measures to prevent, detect and sanction breaches of conservation laws need to be improved, and this is a key issue of enforcement, and we have had discussions now about new instruments that could help with this. For example, an environmental inspections directive has been under discussion, and we're waiting with great curiosity and anticipation to see how the new Commission will take up the work of the old Commission on this, and hoping that there will be some binding instruments on compliance assurance coming out in the near future. We're not holding our breath, but we are still hopeful that they will do something on that. And linking that to the last bullet here, we also see a very strong link between access to justice at the member state level and the issue of better implementation. If citizens are able to take either governments or private entities to court for breaches of environmental legislation, including nature protection legislation, then you immediately expand the number of possibilities that breaches can be challenged. But the reality is that the levels of access to justice across EU member states is very diverse, and in many member states it's very insufficient, either because the costs are excessive or because standing rules are too restrictive. And this is why we have called for many years for a directive on access to justice. Unfortunately, the 2003 proposal was withdrawn by the last Commission. We were told with the intention of replacing it with a new one, but now we have to wait and see whether the new Commission will actually come forward with a new directive on access to justice. And this is, I understand this is currently under consideration at the highest level in the Commission at this moment, and we are very concerned that there should be a legally binding instrument proposed and not simply a non-binding communication saying we need to reflect on this for a few more years. We don't need to reflect on it for a few more years. We have the studies, we have the jurisprudence which shows that this needs to be done, and we have an international treaty, the Aarhus Convention, which is currently, in my view, being violated by the failure of the EU to come to grips with the third pillar of the Aarhus Convention, the access to justice pillar. More generally, again, linking to the Aarhus Convention, other aspects of Aarhus are relevant here, especially in relation to transparency, because transparency can also help with better implementation. At the moment, the conformity reports, as I understand it, are still not available, the reports that see whether a member state is conforming with a piece of legislation. This is still not public domain information. Please, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand this was even an issue that had to be taken to the court by Client Earth to get access to these reports. And I think this is simply scandalous, that it's as if these member states are somehow separate entities, or that their governments are somehow separate entities who have their own rights to privacy. I mean, these are our governments, let's be honest about it. And it's a scandal that with our taxpayers' money, they are hiring lawyers to defend their secrecy of the information, which is actually our information because it's paid for with our money as taxpayers. So this is something which really needs to be challenged. I also want to mention the need for significantly increased funding for the management and restoration of Natura 2000 sites. Moving on to the second targets, well, as the previous speakers have mentioned, there has been some progress here, but more needed. Progress has been achieved in relation to green infrastructure, where we had a strategy adopted in 2013, and also the launch of the natural capital financing facilities being mentioned, and also some progress as regards the knowledge base on ecosystems and their services in the EU, but that's progressing more slowly than anticipated. So we need more progress in these areas, and also there are some opportunities that have not been used, like under the operational programs, under the cohesion structural funds, could have been used more effectively for green infrastructure, and they haven't been. So that's regrettable, and we hope that member states will use those opportunities more in the future. So here we would like to see the EC put in place a coordinated EU-level approach to select and implement trans-European priority axes for green infrastructure that have the highest ecological value for European biodiversity conservation ecosystem provision. And they're of transnational importance. We also would like to see member states implement large-scale ecosystem restoration projects. And we also believe that the decision-making processes need to take full account of the benefits of nature, through a new module of ecosystem accounts in 2016. And here I think it's important to say that the figures that were in one of the earlier presentations showing the very substantial economic benefits from protecting nature, those figures are extremely impressive, and they tend to dwarf the costs of taking the necessary actions to protect nature. But somehow this message isn't getting across. So I think this is something where, well, also we as the environmental movement need to be more effective in getting this message across. But I think we also have to recognize that the system for assessing the impacts of new initiatives inside the Commission is very much skewed in favor of looking at the costs to businesses rather than looking at the benefits, or to put it another way, the costs of not taking action through the lost benefits to nature and to human health and so on. Because when you actually look at these, you see it's a no-brainer. It's such an obvious economic case for action, but it's because the impact assessment process, which started out, I think, with very good intentions and with a good idea behind it as a kind of sustainability impact assessment, has become more and more in its application like a sort of competitivity assessment process. It's become corrupted, and I think it really needs to be looked at. And now we have this better regulation package that has recently been issued, and we need to look closely at that, but there are many disturbing aspects of that. But I do think the impact assessment process is something that we all need to look at very closely as one of these horizontal issues. Moving on to target 3, agriculture and forestry. Well, of course, the greening of the CAP was a major disappointment. The CAP reform itself lost a lot of the green elements that had been proposed by the Commission, and that was already a relatively modest proposal. Now we move on to the stage of implementation by member states, and sadly we see even a further watering down of the remaining green elements, such as the ecological focus areas, where some member states are proposing to grow crops and use pesticides in these areas. So we really need to make efforts to improve the coherence between biodiversity and the relevant sectoral policies, not only agriculture, but the other key ones as well that have been mentioned by the previous speakers, and mainstream biodiversity into the relevant policy areas. And that's something that really isn't happening. The whole idea of environmental integration, where environment would stop being a strong, independent ministry or DG or something, but would be integrated and permeate all the other areas. This hasn't really worked. We've had a sort of backwards integration where short-term economic considerations have in a way, weakened and the environmental initiatives. So you have this bizarre situation where if the EU Commissioner responsible for environment wants to propose a piece of environmental legislation, it has to first pass through another commission, who's called a vice president, who's responsible for jobs, growth, competitivity and investment. I mean, how upside down is the world that we live in these days? It's completely bizarre. Now, did that move on? No, I think it didn't. Yeah, the recommendations in this area. Of course, we need to have a proper assessment and monitoring of the impacts of the new CAP on environmental biodiversity, also with a view to the next CAP reform, which we need to start really seriously preparing for. The EU and the EC and its member states should enforce the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, and also the idea of an initiative on pollinators needs to be brought forward. Fourth target, fisheries. Well, I think the other speakers have already covered this topic well. Of course, the outcome of the CFP discussions was far more positive than what we saw with the CAP. And it does certainly include positive elements, but on the other hand, it doesn't address long-term sustainability of fisheries sufficiently. So a step forward, but still no room for complacency there. Here we would like to see that the Commission and Member States ensure that implementation of the CFP meets this target of halting overfishing through the achievement of maximum sustainable yield goals, through annual negotiations, and also through regional multi-annual plans based on an ecosystem approach. We also would like to see Member States adopt and implement, in line with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, ambitious and effective programs and measures of marine strategies, including development of an ecologically coherent network of well-managed marine protected areas. The fifth target on invasive alien species, this was in a way a cause for celebration last year because it was one of the, I think, greater successes of 2014, the fact that this regulation was adopted, but also its content was relatively satisfactory. But now we move to the implementation question, and achievement of target number 5 will depend on that. And here at the EU level, we need to establish the first list of species, and one that includes all the species that represent a serious threat to Europe's biodiversity, which means that it can't be too short. And at the member state level, once that list is finalised, member states need to quickly carry out a comprehensive analysis of the pathways for introduction of these species that have been listed as of EU concern, to develop action plans to address the pathways that are identified as being of priority, and to establish and implement management plans for species of concerns that are already in Europe. And then the final sixth target on contributing to averting global diversity loss. Well, indeed, as has been said, Europe has not been doing a bad job in some respects on this. We've seen progress, for example, on legislation implementing the Nagoya Protocol. And now the provisions need to be put into place to make the implementing regulation effective. But a major area where more effort is needed is the reducing of indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And here we would refer to one, I mean, there are many examples one could give here, but one particularly I draw attention to is the pressure on biodiversity worldwide, which is caused by Europe's biofuels policies and more generally its bioenergy policies. And we can see that there's only a limit to the amount of bioenergy in general, biofuels in particular, that can be produced sustainably. And so it makes sense to make sure, of course, that there are measures in place to prevent the unsustainable production of bioenergy, but also to recognize that limit. And so this is an area which we think is really important in terms of the EU's footprint, which has been referred to by the other speakers, and especially its biodiversity footprint, which is exceeding the European area. We also need to reform subsidies which are known to have harmful effects in key sectors by improving the contribution of sectoral policies to biodiversity conservation through the midterm review of the multi-annual financial framework in 2016. Well, in conclusion, nearly out of time, I think, we need to see a new level of ambition in the implementation of the Birds and Habitats directives, and also proper and effective integration of biodiversity considerations in all relevant EU policies. And this needs to also be supported by investments. I haven't spoken much about investments, but this is obviously crucial as well. And all of this is needed to prevent further deterioration in nature and ensure that degraded ecosystems are restored. So even while progress has been made in implementing the strategy, for most of the 6 targets, much more progress is needed in order to halt biodiversity loss and to achieve recovery of species, habitats and ecosystems by 2020. Well, before closing, I want to draw attention to the Nature Alert campaign that was launched recently by the EEB and 3 other European networks, BirdLife, Friends of the Earth and WWF. This was launched only a couple of weeks ago, but already we have, well, on the slide it says 140,000 citizens. Just before I started speaking, I saw it was already over 142,000, and probably it's gone up since then, who have told the Commission that they want to see the nature directives maintained and enforced, not weakened. This is, just to put this figure in perspective, the largest ever input to a Commission consultation. I should have said that this is in the context of the Commission's consultation on those laws, which was also recently released. And to put that number in perspective, it's worth recalling that the highest ever number of submissions, which I believe was in relation to TTIP and the ISDS, was only 145,000. So it looks like even during the 2 days of this conference, we will have a higher number, we will pass the existing target. So please do join us and take part in that consultation. Even if you can't with your official hats, you can take them off and do so with your unofficial hats. So thank you very much. I just wanted to end with this image, this very stark image of the fight to protect biodiversity, in this case a fight that involves automatic weapons. Obviously we're in Europe, not in Africa. This is the last male of the northern white rhino, the last on Earth, that's being defended by armed guards day and night. And I think it's a very powerful image which shows, in a way, the good and the bad sides of humanity. The fact that they need to be there, in a way, shows the bad side. The fact that they are there is something positive. Our fight to protect biodiversity in Europe doesn't take this very dramatic form, but it is no less important, and the stakes are no less high. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, also for keeping your presentation within time limits, and of course very important messages that you gave us, also highlighting the shortcomings of policies and also suggesting the ways how the implementation could be improved and enforcement. And I hope that Commission, Francois and others have listened well. Well, probably not the part where he was very critical of the Commission, but for it to be used in the biodiversity review process. And luckily enough, we do have a couple of minutes. I would suggest that we can take 3 questions from the audience, and if there are questions, otherwise we can have it later. So, are there questions? No, everybody's probably desperate for coffee. So, otherwise I would have asked, but okay, I don't want to keep you away from coffee. I understand it is absolutely necessary. So, please enjoy your coffee break that is served outside in the atrium, and be back in 30 minutes, 11:30 sharp. Thank you.